Hello everyone, this is Abhijit Dasgupta from 366 PyTech and welcome to another session of FLO Blockchain App Development by SkyPiCast. We will be having these live online sessions till 15th of September 2018 every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturdays at 9 p.m. IST. So don't forget to tune into all of those to continue in this journey of apps development on FLO Blockchain with us. We would like to thank Ranchi Mall for their continued support in our blockchain journey. We would also like to thank the entire FLO community and its dev team for all the support. In today's session, we will be continuing our RESTful app that we started to build in our previous session in C# using the WCF or Windows Communication Framework and implement some more of the FLO RPC calls in the API. In our previous session, we started with this particular REST API to implement the JSON-RPC calls of FLO blockchain. And in today's session also, we will be continuing the same API and add more endpoints to it. The endpoints that we are going to be adding today are some of these, wherein we will be adding the get balance, get new address, SendToAddress, get transaction, get raw transaction and decode raw transaction RPC calls into our API. If you remember when we talked about the wallet of FLO and we saw the RPC help command in the debug console, we showed you that there are more than 100 RPC calls that are available in the FLO RPC. It is actually not quite possible to implement all of those in this demonstrations and the sessions that we are currently doing. So we are just taking up the APIs or the endpoints that we feel like we are going to be using in the applications that we do in some of our later sessions. So what we have done is we have picked and choose some of the APIs or some of the RPC commands that will be needed to develop the application that we are going to be showing you in our later sessions. So let's go ahead and continue with the API development. Just give me a moment to pause this slideshow and go to Visual Studio. So if you remember, in our previous session, we started creating this particular web service or RESTful API using the WCF framework of Visual Studio or .NET framework. And we created these two endpoints into our API. One was the get info, which is used to retrieve information about the FLO blockchain, and the help endpoint, which actually shows you help details for a particular command if the command is passed as a parameter, and if it is passed, if this particular API is called without any parameter, it actually shows the help command for our FLO RPC, which is the list of all the RPC commands that are available. So let's just run this and see what we created in our previous session and then continue to add more endpoints to it. So if you remember, to run this particular API in the Visual Studio environment, what we just need to do is just click on this run button with the choice of browser that you have selected as default. Mine is Google Chrome. You can choose any other browsers that you have installed from this particular drop down also. So let's just wait for it to compile, and once it starts, we will be having a look at the web service as to what it returns if we call these particular endpoints. So if you remember, we created both these endpoints, the get info and the help endpoints, as HTTP GET methods. It means that they can be called directly via browser URL. So if we just put in our name of the service, which was service1.htc, if you remember, the API URL is something that your Visual Studio IIS Express gives you. Once you host it into a IIS server on your server or anywhere else, you must be getting some other domain name or IP address in place of this. After that, you need to put in the name of the service. We created the service name as service1.svc, and after that we just need to put a / and get the name of the endpoint. So first endpoint that we created was getInfo. We'll just click on this and enter, and we should be getting the output pretty much over here. So this is the exact output that the RPC Debug Console gives you, the FLO Wallet Debug Console actually gives you, and this is something that we are implementing using the APIs. So this is how we created the API in our previous session, and now we tested it that the endpoints are actually working. So let's just move ahead, and what we'll be doing here is we will add the endpoints that we just talked about in the presentation. We will just start adding those endpoints one at a time. The first endpoint that we are going to be adding is the get balance endpoint. It will actually show you the balance that your current wallet has. So we'll just copy paste this operation contract in our interface file and just paste it over here. We just need to change it to something like get balance. Let's just say it is get balance. So our URL would be, the URI template would be whatever our URL for the services, then svc service1.svc / get balance. So if we just type that and type that into our URL into our browser and run, it should pretty much show us the balance that we have available in our FLO wallet. So this is something that we do. Then just let's declare a function that we want. Let's just name that as get balance to, and there is, if you just open this wallet and have a rundown through the RPC calls of this, and let's just see the help command for get balance. Actually, we need to check whether this particular command accepts any parameters also or not. So if you see, the get balance actually accepts a few parameters like account, min, conf, or include watch only, but they are pretty much in our SDK. What we have done is we just accept this account as an optional value. So if you want to pass the account as a value with the get balance, it gives you the balance of that particular account. Let's just talk about what an account is in a FLO wallet. In a FLO wallet, if you want, you can create any addresses or generate any new addresses and group them into something called accounts. So if I create a new address using this command, which is called generate a new address, if you just see this, what we can do is we can actually say that this particular address can be actually mapped into some sort of an account. And once you map addresses into an account, though this account concept has been deprecated in these latest versions of the FLO blockchain, but it is still there. If you want, you can actually group a set of addresses that you generate into an account, and you can manage all those addresses using that one account. So what we can do is, if we want to know the balance of a particular account, it will show the cumulative balance of all the addresses that have been bound to that particular account. But since it has been deprecated, we are pretty much not going to be using that, and we are just going to be using the basic get balance function. So we don't need any sort of parameters over here. So once we have this particular declaration of the operation contract ready for get balance, we'll just go back to our service1.svc.cs or the main implementing class and just copy this particular function that we created. This is pretty easy. If you remember in our previous session also, the first time it was a bit difficult while we were configuring this and creating this for the first time, but once this is available, we can pretty much do anything with this. But if I remember correctly, I think we will have to pass this account also, because in our current SDK version that we already have, it actually requires the account value. That can be either blank also, you don't need to pass that. We'll see how we can just pass any blank value also. So we'll just put this as account equal to null, just as we did in this command equal to null. It means that if you want to access this particular URL, you can just access it using /get balance. And if you want to know the balance of a particular account, we need to add get balance / the account name. So we need to put that, and in this let's just say string account as the parameter. Okay, so let's go back to this implementing class and say get balance is our method, and parameter that we use is account, and if this account value is null or empty, we'll just push it as a blank empty string. In here we will just call, when the RPC calling is done, we'll just call the get balance RPC with this account as the parameter. So if you see, when the user actually accesses this account variable get balance endpoint, he can either send an account or he might not send any account. So this particular value will either be null or it will have some account name. So if it is null, we will just initialize, or we will just assign a empty value to it, so that when the get balance method is called in the SDK, it has either an account value or a blank value. So if the blank value is passed, it will just return the entire wallet's balance, and if an account value is passed, it will show the balance for that particular account. So let's just start and see if it works or not. So once it starts, this is the WCF test line. Once it starts, we will just go to our browser and type in the URL for that, localhost, I guess it was localhost 63262. So we'll just type in the URL for it, 63262 / our service name was service1.svc / get balance. So this should return the balance of our entire wallet. So if you see, I have about whatever balance is available in my account, it is being shown in this particular result, and this API is pretty much working as we required it to. So let's just move ahead and add more endpoints to it. The next endpoint that we are going to be adding will be the get new address, or basically generate new address. So generate new address, what it does is it actually generates a new address for you to use. So whenever we actually create this, we'll just show the help for that, and we'll go there. Okay. So if you see in this particular help window, if you see, we have this get new address help document. It says that returns a new flow address for receiving payments. So whenever we want to create a new address, which as per the best practices, whenever you accept any payment, you should accept it in a new address. But that is entirely up to you. If you want to reuse any address for multiple transactions, you are pretty much free to do so. But as a security feature, it is always suggested that whenever you accept or do any transactions, you should do that in a new address, just for security purposes. So if you just read this particular RPC Command's help button, it says that it returns a new flow address for receiving payments. If account value is specified, it is added to the address book, wherein if you also see, it says that this account attribute is actually deprecated, which means that it is still currently can be used, but it is not suggested to be used because it may be discontinued in future. So this is something that we will keep in mind when we create it. So we will have this feature of account, but we will not be using it. So let's just go ahead into the interface and create a method for this, wherein we create get new address. We'll just copy paste this, and let's just say our endpoint is get new address, and if we want, we can pass the account, or if we do not have any account, we just will pass a blank value. So this is something which can be done, wherein if you want the URL to have the parameter, you can just put this in curly brackets, and if you have a condition wherein this account value or this particular parameter can be null, you just write that parameter name equal to null, so that this WCF REST service will accept null value also in this place. So let's just name this particular method as get new address, just to keep it simple. And at the back end, as usual, we'll just click copy this and implement this get new address, and pretty much everything would be same. It's just that we just need to change this get balance to get new address, and that is pretty much all we need to do. And this is pretty much done. So let's just go ahead and add some more endpoints to it, like the send, get transaction, get raw transaction, decode raw transaction. We'll just implement all of those at once, and then run this API once and check all those when we have done. So let's just add the next endpoint, which is the get transaction. So get transaction, what it does is it basically gives you details about a transaction when you pass a particular transaction ID to it. So let's just create the operation contract for it, and we'll say that its name is get transaction. Okay, and in this, the parameter that we will be accepting is we will name it TXID or the transaction ID. But here I am not going to be putting an equal to null. That is why, because I want this particular parameter to come, because if we put equal to null here, it means that this particular parameter will be optional parameter, but I don't want that to be an optional parameter, because for this particular RPC command or get transaction to work, you have to have this particular parameter, because without passing the transaction ID, this particular RPC command won't work. So whatever you put in this particular curly brackets as a parameter, you need to use the same name when you are defining the variables as parameters in this function. So let's just say its method name is get transaction, and we'll just do the same what we did in our previous method. We'll just since it won't be a null value, we will just remove this if condition, because we don't expect this value to be null, and we'll just change this to get transaction, and the value would be TXID, that means the transaction ID, and the RPC when we are calling this particular sentence. This particular statement is actually the one which is calling the SDK and getting things done. So it just needs to know which method you are trying to get. So the method that we are trying to implement here is the get transaction, and it will be getting the transaction ID or the TXID variable as a parameter. So we are pretty much set over here also. So the next API that we are going to do is the get raw transaction and then the decode raw transaction. So these two transactions, or these two RPC calls, I'll just show you after I have created these API endpoints. I'll just show you what they actually do, and we'll actually get to know these APIs in the wallet also, what their RPC commands are doing and how they will help us in actual application development when we actually do so. So the next API that we are going to implement here will be a get raw transaction. So we'll just call it get raw transaction. So the get raw transaction, it will also require the transaction ID. So we will keep this TXID parameter over here as is, and we'll just change the name over here, get raw transaction. So name this as get raw transaction, and while we are at it, let's just create the last operation contract, which is a decode raw transaction. We'll do that also, and after that we'll just do the implementation at one go. So the decode raw transaction, what it requires is, it doesn't require a transaction ID, but it requires a hex string, which is the hex value of the transaction, which is returned by this get raw transaction. We'll go through all the sequences just a while after I create these, and I'll let you know what is happening over here. So in this, we are going to be calling it get decode raw transaction. So we are done with these get API endpoints that we intended to create in this interface, and let's just implement these two last operation contracts which we skipped, and we'll just, as usual, copy paste this. And just copy paste that, and that's one that I want to create is the get raw transaction. So it will be known as get raw transaction. It will accept the transaction ID, and what we'll do is we'll just change this method name in the RPC calling over here, and everything else is as is. It's pretty much same as get transaction and raw transaction are pretty much same in terms of calling in this particular API. The last one is the decode raw transaction. I'll just copy the name of the function that I declared, and I'll just paste that in place of the parameter. In place of TXID, it's the hex string or the hash string, whichever you want to call it, and we'll just pass on over here, and the decode raw transaction needs to come over here. So we are pretty much done. So just before testing this particular API, let's just go ahead into the debug console and see actually what these transactions or the APIs that we created actually do. So let's just go to the interface and see what we have created till now and see their effects in the actual RPC world. So if you see, the first RPC that we created yesterday was the get info and the help command. So those are pretty much what we did. The get balance, what it does is it actually shows you the balance of your particular wallet that you have. Once you have that, we created one RPC call or an endpoint which was called get new address. So this get new address, what it does is, if you just type in get new address and press enter, you will get this particular hexadecimal value. And what is this? This is the address for receiving flow. So what it did is, in the backend, it created a public private key pair wherein the private key has been encrypted and kept in the wallet file of this particular wallet, and you can access that using the dump private key, and you can get the string for that, but that is secured. What you also will be getting here is this particular string, which is the public key or your flow address. So this is the public key which you can share with your friends or anyone whom you are receiving the flow from. So from their wallet, they will use this particular address in the send option and paste this and send n number of flows to you, and that flow will be available and visible in your wallet. So this get new address RPC command, what it is doing is, it is actually creating a new key pair or a public private key pair, or basically creating a new address to receive flow. The next RPC call that we implemented in the API is the get transaction. So let's just copy one transaction that we have in our transaction list, and let's just say I have got some flow or the transactions that we did in the donation app. Let's just see where we have those. Yep, this is the donation app transaction that we did. And what I'm going to do here is, I just double clicked on my wallet's transaction screen, that particular transaction, and I'm just going to be copying this transaction ID. This is a alphanumeric value, the transaction ID. Whenever you do any transaction, you get this for your transaction, which is a unique across the blockchain. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to get details for that particular transaction using the get transaction RPC call. What you need to do is, you just need to type get transaction and then paste any transaction ID that you have with a space and then type in. So if you see, when we ran this particular RPC command, the get transaction, it is actually showing us all the details about the transaction that we did. It is showing the number of confirmations, the block hash, the block index, the block time, the transaction ID, the wallet conflicts or account, from where it came, from where it went, everything. But if you see, you are not able to see the flow data or the comments that we added in the transaction. That is not available. And this entire transaction's hex is available over here. So the next API that we implemented using the RPC calls is the get raw transaction. And let's just see what the raw transaction is and how is it different from the get transaction. So what we need to do is we need to do get raw transaction RPC call, and we are again going to paste the same transaction ID which we did for the previous command. And if we run this time, what you are seeing here is a series of alphanumeric values, and it's a huge value that we have got. And what this is it is the hex value for the entire transaction, and it is pretty much the same that you were seeing in this get transaction hex value also. So get raw transaction, what it does is it actually returns you the hex or the hash value for your transaction. And if you want to get the entire details of your transaction, it's a two-step process. You first need to know the transaction hex with the get transaction or get raw transaction by passing the transaction ID. Once you have the hex for that particular transaction, you just copy it and you call another RPC command, which is the decode raw transaction. So decode raw transaction, what it does is it actually decodes the entire transaction which has been passed as a hex string. And I'll just press the enter button. And now you see this particular transaction which we were seeing above here also. You're seeing that particular transaction details in JSON format over here also, wherein the transaction ID, its hash, its lock time, size, everything is written. And along with that, the most important part that we actually require is this particular message, which is the flow data. So if you want to access the flow data part of any transaction, you need to do it in two steps. One is to get the hex string for that particular transaction using either the get raw transaction or the get transaction commands. Once you have the hex string, you just pass in that hex string to the decode raw transaction and you get all these. So we will be using these commands in sequence when we create our web application, when we create it in our next sessions. So that is why we are actually going through these RPC commands and implementing those into our APIs. So we have pretty much got all the API endpoints that we wanted to create in this particular API. The only API that I have left here is the SendToAddress, the most important API that we are going to be implementing. The SendToAddress is the actual RPC command which is going to be implemented in this API. This is the RPC command which is actually going to make the transactions. So when you are going to make an application over the web which will use this API, if we do not have that SendToAddress API implemented, we won't be able to do any transactions into the blockchain. We will only be able to see details which are available through these APIs, but we won't be able to do any transactions. So what we need to do is we need to implement the API for the SendToAddress also. So before implementing that, let's just go ahead and see the RPC help for that particular command and see what our requirements for implementing that particular RPC call would be. So let's just say we type help and we say SendToAddress in our FLO Debug Console. And if you see, this is the RPC command that we were talking about. This is the RPC command which actually creates transactions and sends those transactions to the blockchain. So the SendToAddress, what it requires is the address to whom you are sending the transaction to, the actual amount of flow that you are transacting. These two particular values are actually required or non-optional values, compulsory, mandatory values which you need to pass. Apart from this, you have a few other attributes or parameters also, like comment, comment to, subtract fee from amount, replaceable, conf target, estimate mode, and flow data. All these parameters are actually optional. If you want, you can send them into your transaction. If you do not want, you can pretty much leave them. But for our application purposes, our API should implement all these. And if you see, we have some of the parameters which are required and some which are not. So from the user, if we want to accept these number of parameters into the API, if we separate them using the / like we were doing over here, wherein we type in the API endpoint and then / the parameters, you can pretty much add n number of parameters by putting slashes and / and then declaring the actual parameters. But when we have a lot of parameters to accept in the URL, it is not very much suggested to use a get method, and that is the reason why we are going to be using a post method to accept send transactions or SendToAddress transactions. It is also for security purposes also, wherein in get you can see all the data in the URL, in post you won't be able to. So for that particular purpose, what we are going to be doing here is we are going to first create a class which will have all the members which are needed as parameters for the SendToAddress. So for that, what we are going to do here is we are going to right click on our FLO web service project, and we are going to add a class which will contain the data classes that are required for our request for this SendToAddress. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a setter getter class wherein all my parameters which are required for SendToAddress will be declared in a request SendToAddress class, and I will be using an object of that to perform all the transactions that I receive. So I'll just click on add and then new item, and a new item window that comes will select a class under, if you see we have this Visual C# on the left side, and under there we have a category called code. When you click on code, you have these options. We'll just click on class and name it as any name you want to give. I just am going to name it as data class, and I'm just going to click it add, and this is the data class that has been created. So the next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a class for our SendToAddress request. So whenever user is going to make any request, he or she is going to make a request in form of a JSON. I'm going to show that to you also using a tool called Postman, which actually calls our restful APIs using get or post or any method. So we will just see how that particular transaction is also done. So what we are going to do here is we are going to create a class called it's a public class called let's say SendToAddress request. So this particular class will be used to accept the requests that come from the user. Under this, in C#, you can create your classes with get set methods for getting and setting values from this class member variables using a very small shortcut key which is called a property, and you just type in PROP, short for property, and you just click on or press the tab button, and C# what it does is it actually creates the entire line by itself. You just need to press tab and you just need to change the data type and the property names. So I'm just going to change the data type as string and then name my property as address just to accept the flow address. And I'm just going to copy this, and the next property that I'm going to create here is the amount, which will be used to store the amount that is being transacted. The third one would be comment. It is the comment that is stored in the wallet itself, not pretty much on the blockchain. The fourth one would be comment2. This is also used to store in the wallet only, doesn't go to the blockchain. The fifth one would be subtract fee from output. Okay, sorry, subtract fee from amount. So if you remember, when we talked about the wallet and the RPC command and the SendToAddress command as a whole, we told you that this particular parameter of SendToAddress, it is actually a Boolean value, but in here we are just keeping it as string, and we will pass true or false values. So if you pass true, what it does is the amount that you are transacting, the transaction fee gets deducted from that. So for example, if you are transacting one flow and the transaction fee is, for example, let's say it's 0.1. So the transaction fee of 0.1 flow will be deducted from the 1 flow that you are transacting, and the receiver will not get the 1 whole flow, but he will be getting 9.9 flow after subtracting the transaction fee. But if you put the subtract fee from amount value as false, the transaction fee will be deducted extra from the sender's wallet. So the receiver will be getting the whole amount, and the transaction fee will be deducted from the sender's wallet actually. The next parameter that we are going to be declaring here is the replaceable. This is also a Boolean value, which if set allows the transaction to be replaced by some other transaction with a higher transaction fee. But if you set it to false, your transaction won't be replaced by some other transaction with a higher transaction fee. So this is something that you can choose as per your requirements. The next one is conf target. It is actually an integer value or a numeric value. It will be in form of, it will be a value wherein, an integer value wherein you can put in 1, 2, 3, 4 or any values, and it is the number of confirmations or the target confirmations that you want your transaction to have. The next one is the estimate mode. The estimate mode is a value, if you see the help value, it has these particular values, which is unset, economical or conservative. So these are the estimate modes for the fee estimate, the transaction fee estimate. So we can just put it to any which one we want. We can have it as conservative, economical or unset. The default is unset. So we will just use that. And after that, the last parameter that we are going to define is actually the most important is the flow data. So this is actually the parameter or the property that will hold the flow data value that the user wants to store in the blockchain. So let's just go ahead and create our operation contract for the SendToAddress. It will be a little different from the previous one, wherein we created the operation contracts based on the get method HTTP, but this one will be a post method. Okay, and what we are going to be doing here is we are actually going to be changing this endpoint to SendToAddress, and we are not going to receive any parameter or arguments in the URL. So we don't need that. So we will, the URL for this particular endpoint would just be your base URL followed by /SendToAddress. And the data that needs to come in will come in form of a post, and that will be in type of SendToAddress request. This is the class, and we just call this parameter as requests, let's just say, and the name of this method will be SendToAddress. So this SendToAddress when called will actually accept a SendToAddress type of data, which will be in form of JSON, and it will receive that particular format of data into this request object and then try to process it. So let's just go ahead and implement this. So we'll just copy one of the previously created functions just to save some time, and we just name the method to SendToAddress, and the type of parameter that is accepting will be SendToAddress request, and the name of the parameter is request. So let's just say that, and in this, if you remember, we have a few of the transaction parameters which are actually optional. So for our development purposes and for our purpose in application development, what we are going to do here is we are going to be setting all those values like replaceable, conf target, and we will set some default values to it. But the comment and the comment to values and the flow data, which are all string values, which the user only actually mentions in the transaction, if those are empty values or the user has not put any values, we need to handle those over here. So we are going to just put some if string dot is null or empty conditions over here. null or empty, and the first thing that we are going to be checking here is the request object's comment parameter or the comment member. So the comment member or the comment value could be something that could be null or empty. So if it is null or empty, we are just going to be storing empty space over here or an empty value over here. An empty value like stored with double quotes and null value are handled differently in programming languages. So if we encounter something which is empty or null, we just store a blank value or a blank string over here. So the first thing that we are checking here is the comment. The second one would be the comment 2, and we will be just doing the same for this. And the third one, what we are going to do here is the flow data. So if the flow data is also blank, we need to handle that. So if the flow data is also empty, we just store an empty string over here. So once we are done, what we are going to do here is we are going to call the RPC SendToAddress from the SDK, and we are just going to put all the parameters that are required. So the first parameter that it requires is the address. If you just start typing this method, you will actually be able to see all the parameters that are required. So here the first one is the address, then amount, and comment. We just need to put all those values as is they are coming. So the request address, the address would be in the request object's address parameter. So we'll just pass that, then comma the decimal amount. The decimal amount, if you remember, even the amount and the conf target, which are actually integers and decimal values, we accepted them as string in our data class. So when we have those as string, we need to convert them into the requisite data type before we call them into this SendToAddress RPC call. So we will just convert this particular value. Convert dot to decimal is a method wherein we are converting the request dot amount. So this amount value will first be converted into a decimal value and then passed into the SendToAddress method. The next is the request dot comment. So that is pretty much a string. So we just need to pass that as request dot comment. The next is the request dot comment 2. So we'll just pass that as similarly request dot comment 2. Then we have this particular value, which is the conf target and subtract fee from amount and all those things. These are not in form of string, but they are in the next one is a boolean value. So we have that in request dot subtract fee from amount, but we need to convert this first into a boolean value. So we will use the convert function, convert classes to boolean function, and what it will do is it will convert a string into a boolean value. So the value that we are trying to convert to boolean is request dot subtract fee amount. Okay, so once that is done, we just add a comment. The next one is the bool replaceable. So this is also a boolean value that is accepted by the SDK, but since we have accepted this as a string in our data class, we are just going to be converting this into boolean and pass the name of the method, which is request dot replaceable. Okay. The next one is the integer value, which is the conf target. Again, we need to convert it to an integer value. So we are going to use the convert dot to int 32, and we are going to be passing the request dot conf target. So these are the values that are coming, and the next one is a string estimate mode. So we will just put it as is because it's a string value. So this is the string dot estimate mode, and the last parameter that this particular method receives is the flow data. So that will also be exactly in a string format, so we don't need to convert it to anything. So we have this request dot flow data, and once we have this particular method created and the calling is pretty much created, nothing else is needed. it will just call the API, actually the SDK, and perform the transaction of SendToAddress to this address, and the amount will be this, and all the options we have mentioned. It will just do the transaction and return back a value, which is the transaction ID. So we are pretty much done with this particular API definition. Let's just run this API for once and test whatever we just created. For testing any APIs, you can test the APIs which are in GET format using the browser window. But if you are trying to test any APIs which is not in GET or in POST, is available in POST, you need some sort of a tool that can make these POST requests for you. There are a lot of tools and applications that are available for making RESTful web API calls. What I am using over here today is a tool called Postman. So that is a tool that I use for testing my web APIs or my web services. So I'm going to be using that particular tool. You can use anything. You can Google for any REST API transactions. Oops, I think we have some issues and we need to fix those before we can do something. Let's see what the error is. Okay, false alarm. It actually ran successfully. So I'm just going to show you one of the transactions using the Postman. Let me just start the Postman client and then I'll just show you. So this is the application that I was talking about. This is called Postman. This particular application actually allows you to test any APIs which you have created or any API that is publicly available or you have. You can just test those transactions using this particular Postman tool. What you need to just do is you just need to put the request URL for the API over here. You need to set the method for calling the API, which is get, post, or anything that you have. If there are some request body that is required, in case of our SendToAddress, we will be passing the request in form of a JSON. We can pass that. You can put in any type of authorization if your APIs have. Some APIs do have some authorization for access, so we can do that. So what we are going to do here is we are going to be actually calling the API using this particular method, and we are going to be calling the local host. We need to type in the entire URL. And we are going to be calling the web services URLs that we got. So let's just call the get balance first. So we'll be typing the get balance, and since it's a get method, we just click on send, and we should be able to see the output from output in this bottom screen. So if you see, the get balance method is actually returning the balance over here, and the response is pretty much there. You see, the next thing that we are going to be trying is the get new address. So we'll just change this to get new address, and we'll just click on the send button, and it will make the API call to generate a new address. So if you remember, in the debug console of our FLO RPC wallet, we saw that when we call the get a new address RPC call, it generates a new address. So if you see, when we created this API and called it, what it did is it actually requested the API to generate a new address. The API, when it received the request, it called the FLO RPC using the SDK that we have, using the SDK connector, and it got the address generated and returned it as a result parameter. So this is the address that got generated by the FLO blockchain, and we got FLO wallet actually, and we got this as response. So the next API that we are going to test here is the get transaction. So before that, let's do a transaction using the SendToAddress, and we will see the details using these three APIs. So the next thing that we are going to do here is the SendToAddress. Okay, SendToAddress, and we are going to do a post request for it. If you remember, we created a post method for accepting this particular API, and we need to pass values as per these parameters using a JSON. So for that, once you click on this particular method of API calling, which is post over here, you will see that you will have this particular section called body. In the body, what you need to do is you need to click on this raw value, raw radio button, and when you click on raw, you have this option of setting the type of data that you are going to create and pass as a request. So the type of value that we are going to be sending to our application is a JSON value. So its content type is application JSON, and we are going to just create a JSON value. So the JSON value generally is a value which is accepted as a key value pair, and it is passed in form of in between curly brackets. So the first parameter that we are going to pass here is the address, and this is an address, and then followed by colon the value that needs to be passed. So let's just create this particular request, and then we will add the different values or the transactional values over here. So first is the address, then the next parameter is actually the amount. Okay, it was in small a, I guess, amount, and once we have that, we need to put in that amount of flow that we need to transact. The third one is comment. I'm just copy pasting it from another screen, the comment value. Then we have comment 2, need to be in double quotes. So we are pretty much creating the request JSON which is required to be pushed into the API. So that is what we are currently trying to do. The next one would be subtract free from amount, and we'll accept its value. Then we have replaceable as the parameter, and we have this. Next is the configuration or the confirmation target, which is called conf target, and we'll use this to accept its value. And the next two is the estimate mode. So when you are creating these applications which will be actually calling these APIs, these things are done at the code level, wherein you will have the classes available with you, and those classes will create these JSONs automatically for you. You don't need to actually manually create these. So let's just, we have created the request JSON. We just need to add the values that will be passed in form of these values. So what we are going to do is we're just going to copy address that we already have. So we are actually transacting amount directly into our own address only. So the receiver and sender will be myself only. So the address, this is the address that I'm going to send the transaction to, and I'm going to be sending, say for example, 1.0 flow. Oops. I'm going to be sending 1.0 flow. So this is the value that I need to pass, 1.0. And the comment is, let's say, test. The comment 2 is also test. Subtract fee from amount, I do not want to subtract it, so I will just say false. I do not want the fee to be transacted from this amount. The replaceable, I don't want my transaction to be replaced, so I say false. The confirmation target, I want just 1 as the confirmation target. So I'll just say 1. The estimate mode will be set to the default, which is unset, and the flow data that I want is, let's say this is a test message from FLO API. So let's just see that, and we will be calling this, and hopefully we will be getting a transaction ID after this particular transaction has been successfully executed. So let's just hope that it executes correctly. So we'll click on the send button, and the API is called, and if you see, we just got a response which is actually the transaction ID. So this transaction ID is actually the transaction that we did, and this transaction could be seen in the FLO Blockchain Explorer or using the get transaction details, get transaction API that we called using, if you see, we created these endpoints, get transaction, get raw transaction, decode. We'll just check this particular transaction ID from them. We're just double clicking on it, and I'm going to copy this transaction ID and changing this particular method to get from post, and I'm saying get transaction. So this get transaction API will give me details for the transaction ID that I passed. So forward slash and then the transaction ID that we just did, and when we click on send, it should give us a detail of all the transaction details that we have. So if you see, this is the transaction detail of this particular transaction that we currently did. So in here, since it is just a get transaction, it is showing some details, but it is not showing the flow data. It is just giving us the hex value. So we are going to be getting testing another of the APIs, which is the get raw transaction. And in the get raw transaction, what we will be getting is only the hex value for this particular transaction, and we'll just test it by clicking on the send button. And if you see, we are getting the raw transaction, including the hex value and also this flow data value. So the decode raw transaction is also there over here, and we'll just again call the decode. Let's just get that, get the hex data copied, and call in the decode raw transaction and pass this entire value as parameter. Oops. I think this is an issue that we did not handle, because if you see, the value that we are passing is quite large. In any type of APIs that we create, the parameter or the URL size is limited in HTTP protocol. So in our case, the URL that we are trying to form is pretty much violating that. So we should have created this particular API in form of post instead of get, and if we do that, we will pretty much get this. But if you see, the SDK, actually the SDK that we created, get raw transaction, in the SDK, the get raw transaction also pretty much gives you a decoded value of the transaction only. So if you just pass in the get raw transaction with the transaction ID also, you will be getting the entire transaction data, including the flow data also. So in our SDK, we have actually implemented the get raw transaction and decode raw transaction similarly, so that you don't have to do two transactions. So this is something wherein we did this transaction, and this flow data is also available. But if you do want to implement the decode raw transaction, I would suggest that you do that in form of post instead of the get. So this is pretty much it, guys. We have implemented some of the RPC calls that we wanted to have in form of APIs, and we have implemented that in this API, and we are going to be using these APIs to create some applications from the next session that we start. That's a surprise, that's what we are going to be creating, and we are going to be having multiple sessions divided for that particular application, because it is going to take some time. So we will be dividing our time between different functionalities of creating that application, and we will finish that in the due course. So that's it for today, and I hope that this particular session was an informative session for you. As always, if you have any suggestions, feedback or questions, do reach us at abhijit@366spytech.com, and please make sure to subscribe and like our YouTube channel, and also join us on the Telegram channel of SkyPiCast. Also, please do spread the word about SkyPiCast and the session so that we can reach more of you in the future. Thanks and goodbye, and see you in the next session, guys.